Here, the NSSI selects books for their Space Professional reading list and invites authors to Peterson to discuss their books with the greater Colorado Springs Space Professional community. Mr. Milner is an author and a journalist whose writings appear in the New York Times, the New Yorker, New York, Bloomberg Business Week, The Guardian, Slate, Salon, Wired, Village Voice, Rolling Stone, Ars Technica, Spin, Blender, The New York Sun, and the Sunday Times of London. His book, Perfecting Sound Forever, an oral history of recorded music, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. His most recent book, Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds, was named one of the best books of 2016 by the Financial Times, the Times of London, and Strategy Plus Business. Originally from Hawaii, he now lives with his family in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Mr. Milner. That's forward and back.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. It's a real thrill to be back here. It's one of the first places I went when I started doing research for the book, and so this is kind of like, for me, one of those dreams you have where all of a sudden you didn't study for finals or something, because I'm in front of people who probably know 10 times more about GPS than I do. But what I want to do today is kind of just give a little bit of a history of sort of what brought me to GPS and what I think makes GPS interesting, and something that that we should think a lot about, we meaning the world. So I'm going to try to start off by telling you a story about how I got into, how I discovered GPS. Before I wrote this book, I knew, no exaggeration, I knew nothing about GPS. I didn't even know what it was. I wasn't sure if it was just a catch-all term for navigation technologies or what. But something happened. Everyone obviously here is probably familiar with Google Maps Street View, where you can see, you probably looked up your house. And so I want to imagine that you're working for Google. You're driving the car that takes those pictures automatically. It snaps, I think, once a second. You're driving through Manhattan's east side, and you're looking out the windshield, and all of a sudden you see something up ahead. You get closer, and you see this. Now, the driver probably didn't actually see this because he or she was probably just driving straight ahead. Probably just went right on by. Oops. Sorry. So this photo here, taken from Street View, circulated around the internet around 2009 or 2010. By the time I saw it, it had been actually wiped from Google Street View and replaced with another photo of the same corner. Although I managed to find, they didn't scrub it very well, and through doing a little digging, I was able to find the photos that led right up to it that I showed you there. So you can see it shows a man, looks like a man lying in the street. And the more I looked at this photo, and again, remember, I knew nothing about GPS at this point, the more fascinated by it I got. I mean, for one thing, I know that corner really well because that building there is a high-end audio store. And so I remember talking to people there when I wrote my book on recorded sound. But this photo I just thought was so striking that, and it occurred to me that I didn't know what GPS was, but I kind of knew that probably Google Maps wouldn't exist without it. So somehow GPS was responsible for this amazing photo, and I decided I wanted to find out everything I could about the photo. I even wanted to try to find out what happened or who that person was. I actually went so far as to, actually putting up flyers around the area that asked if people remembered seeing this, if they were anyone in the photo. And actually, I got a response from someone who said they remembered seeing the photo. They remembered they were walking with a work colleague. I mean, not the photo, the actual event. They remember walking by and seeing that man lying in the street and the people gathered around him, and they found it really disturbing, and they didn't talk about it for the rest of the time, but it stuck with him. So based on that, I thought I could figure out at least when this happened, because he said he remembered that he was talking about the first iPhone coming out at the time. That was making like spring 2007. But he said, no, there's no way, because he wasn't living around there at the time. It had to be another year. So I even found this guy right here. Oops, sorry. This person right here, who it was no longer working at the store, but whenever this photo was taken was an employee at that store. He didn't remember it even happening. So the long and the short of it is I could never find out what happened in this photo. And to this day, I really wonder. But it struck me that somehow GPS was implicated in this. Like that because of GPS, we were able to see this incredibly intimate moment in someone's life, maybe their last moments on Earth. Who knows? Because that looks like that person's not doing too good. So because I couldn't find, basically, I didn't, from a journalism standpoint, I didn't know the who, what, why, how, or when, but all I knew was where. I was even able to use Google Maps to pinpoint those coordinates. But that got me thinking, well, like, what does where here even mean? Like, who controlled that? Who said that that's what that spot is? And that's what got me going with GPS. It's what got me to visit here and learn about how the vast infrastructure that controls GPS. And then that made me think about, well, what about the data itself? And that led me to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And so I realized there's this whole sort of huge infrastructure around the world that was all responsible for me knowing the only thing I could about that photo, which was where exactly it happened. And that's kind of what got me on my journey to GPS. So probably what I'm going to show you here, that's what I found out, WGS 84, of course, what the world as we know, that's what I realized was ultimately responsible. I want to talk a little bit about what I discovered in my journey about GPS, and these are things that probably aren't going to be news to you, but I want to give you sort of my perspective of why I think they're really interesting in a bigger picture. Probably one of the most surprising things I learned about GPS when I was doing my research was about precision agriculture. Whenever I tell people that some of the food they ate today was surely grown because of GPS, they're really surprised. But and I visited beet farmers out in Fort Collins who told me that it's GPS precision agriculture has completely changed their lives, because if they know exactly to the millimeter where they put a seed, and they know they can put the exact same place water and fertilizer, and even map the field and know which parts of the field are maybe need more water than others or whatever, it adds up, all those savings. So they have some of the most sophisticated GPS setups in the world that use not only GPS, but use GLONASS satellites and other private satellites. In fact, they told me when they can tell when GLONASS is having problems because their machines aren't as precise. But precision agriculture now is one of the most, if not the most fastest growing cottage industries within GPS, because people are realizing the economic power of just knowing where everything is. Especially in certain parts of the world, like in Asia and the Pacific, it's just an exploding industry, and it's used in farms of all levels. And again, I think the object lesson here on a bigger picture is that what GPS has shown us is that there's power in knowing where, potentially where anything in the world is. There's an economic power and other kinds of power. Fleet management. That's a polite euphemism for GPS tracking. What I found interesting about fleet management is, first of all, besides precision agriculture, it's also one of the fastest growing segments of the GPS industry, and for similar reasons. Basically, people in this industry all told me, well, this is recession proof, because these systems pay for themselves. When people know that they're being tracked, they just behave a lot better, and they're a lot more efficient. They make fewer stops. And it's gotten to the point now where if you work for a company, where you drive a company car or you drive a part of a government fleet, there's a really good chance you're being tracked. And I'm going to tell you what I find interesting about this. When people ask me what GPS is, I often say, well, it's a complicated question because it's hard to say what exactly GPS is. To me, usually I say GPS is the signal itself. And so really what it comes down to is GPS is really just a blank slate, as I put it, just a radio signal. One of the most interesting things I learned when I first came here was, I forget who I was talking to, but we were talking about the three segments of GPS: space, control, and user. And they told me, here, we're responsible for the first two. The third one is out of our hands. Like once the signal leaves the satellite, it's up to you what you do with it. So in the history of GPS, the person who deserves to be called the godfather of GPS more than anyone else, Brad Parkinson, who really got the GPS program going in the early 70s, to him, GPS was a way to have a better precision bombing system, because he was dismayed by how the air campaigns in Vietnam had gone, and he envisioned that there could be a better, more humane way to wage air warfare than what happened in Vietnam. So that for him was the vision. there's nothing inherent in GPS that makes that the right thing to do with it, or this the right thing to do with it, but we sort of, as a world, as a culture, a global culture, we've decided that tracking people is one of the things that GPS is best used for. Now, of course, one of the reasons that couldn't be envisioned back in the early 70s is that you need like a cellular network in order to do this, or some sort of communications network. But still, it just goes to show that if you send a signal from space that's incredibly dependable on all levels, that the sky is really the limit in what you can do with it. And that's what I think people should understand more about GPS who don't think about it as much. The thing with fleet management is, here's an example of the kind of social effects of GPS. That's Newark Liberty International Airport. This, in New Jersey, this stretch of I-95 right here, the New Jersey Turnpike, is often called by security experts the most dangerous mile in America, because you have pretty much every example of critical infrastructure almost within this area. You've got shipping, you have rail, you have factories. There's a factory here that has a huge tank of chlorine gas that if that were to rupture would cause problems for thousands of people. And of course you have the airport. So you have all these potential targets. In 2010, I think it was, people were testing a new GPS-based landing system at Newark International Airport. And they were finding that it was basically failing several times a day for a few seconds at a time. And what they realized was happening was that there were so many people with GPS jammers driving on the New Jersey Turnpike that it was affecting the landing system. And by the way, just as there's a polite euphemism for GPS tracking, fleet management, there's a polite euphemism for GPS jammers, which are personal privacy devices. But that's really what it's about. I mean, right? GPS is such a big thing in the world now that we have a large group of people dedicated to making it fail, at least as far as their position is concerned. And I think that's a testament to, like, 'cause, right here, you had people using GPS to try to land planes, basically, and over here, you had people using GPS to build a sort of cloud around themselves so their bosses wouldn't know where they were. And so that's how flexible GPS is. I mean, really, there's so many things you can do with it, both for good or for ill. But of course, timing is the thing that I think when I talk to people on GPS that they really don't, they probably know the least about. Timing, of course, as I'm sure all of you here know, by certain measures is now what GPS is used for even more than geolocation in terms of sort of how widely it's used. So of course it's used for to regulate mobile phone networks and to regulate financial transactions, to timestamp them. This has given rise to, and it's something that I'm really interested in, and I look forward to talking to you all more about, is the idea of spoofing. In my research, I talked to an engineer at the University of Texas who basically made it his mission to show how vulnerable GPS was to spoofing. He started out by spoofing a drone that's in the desert in front of representatives from the Pentagon and Homeland Security, and then he went and kept doing things. He said, here's the clock that's used on electrical grids. I can spoof that. And here's the clock used at the New York Stock Exchange. I can spoof that. This, by the way, are all the servers of the stock exchange. And his worry there is that not so much the stock exchange itself, but all the traders who co-locate their servers right on the same site so they can be as close to the exchange as possible, because they're all high-frequency traders and want that extra little nanosecond advantage. He says their clocks are basically not secure. And it goes to show how widely GPS has sort of infiltrated our world, that he can envision, and has a good argument for like what could possibly happen, is that if some of those clocks were spoofed and the automatic programs, because they were getting a confusing GPS signal that made no sense to them, pulled out of the market, that could create a cascading effect. And that's, as far as I understand, and like I said, I'd like to talk to you more about this, is the biggest problem with GPS now, not the security so much of the overall system, but more on the ground, localized problems that could cascade into major ones. NASA is another thing that when I tell people GPS is used for, just completely, they find it amazing. I mean, this is the deep space network antennas. This is what NASA uses to guide spacecraft. And next to these, you can't see them, of course, but there's little black boxes containing GPS receivers, the same GPS signal that all of us use for anything else. And the reason they have to use it, I was told, is because there's no GPS in space. So the spacecraft en route to Mars has to measure its location based on receivers on Earth, and because the Earth is unstable, if a high pressure front comes across and smacks into the Rockies and the world wobbles a little bit, that matters, and so they constantly have to update the signal being sent out based on GPS. So basically, this is another one too, earthquakes. The fact that GPS can measure tectonic plate movement is amazing to me. And the fact that they now have these networks which they realize could be retrofitted so that they can help predict earthquakes sooner, because what happens when megaquakes hit, when the big one hits Southern California and the Pacific Northwest, they're both overdue, the megaquakes tend to overwhelm traditional seismic instruments. So basically people can't really tell how powerful the earthquake is. And that was a problem in 2011 in Japan when that quake and tsunami hit. Japan has the most sophisticated earthquake detection system in the world and an incredibly sophisticated network of GPS receivers to measure plate movement, but they weren't integrated. So what happened was, it was a long time, I think it's something like 40 minutes before officials could calculate how powerful the quake was and therefore how big the tsunami was that was coming. And to show you how much GPS is going to be sort of controlling our lives is maybe an overly dramatic way to put it, but become part of our lives is people at the University of California and other places are working with these things. They're placed all around the West. And what's going to happen eventually is they'll be set up so that if a megaquake hits, they'll all send data back to some central location which will determine how big it is. And if it's big, it'll automatically send messages to utilities that will shut the gas lines off, for example, because that's what's going to happen when the big quakes hit. There's going to be gas lines ruptured and lots of fires. So really, GPS runs every aspect of our life. And if there was one thing I tried to make clear in the book, that was it. But I want to step back a little here now and kind of look at GPS on a more sort of symbolic level, almost like what does GPS do? What does GPS do to the way we see the world? This is a portrait of Captain James Cook, the famous British explorer. Beginning in 1768, he completed 3 voyages of the Pacific that really opened up the Pacific to European exploration. When he first started, he became fascinated by the idea that there was this huge, vast stretch of ocean. I mean, the Pacific covers a third of the Earth, with these little dots of land in it, and somehow people were able to settle those lands. And he wondered, how could they possibly do that? How were they able to navigate like that? When he was in Tahiti, he met a navigator named Tupaya. Tupaya, for various reasons, had to leave town. He had angered the royalty. And so he talked his way aboard Cook's ship, the Endeavor, and said, I'll help you navigate. And one of the things he could do that really just made it was almost like a parlor trip on board, is that the sailors would ask him, all right, point to Tahiti right now, and he could immediately do it, because he somehow had it in his mind, no matter where the ship was pointing, where he was in relation to his home. He ended up drawing this map here, which is a map of the Pacific, essentially 2,600 miles, almost, basically the size of the continental United States. But the map looked strange. It didn't really make any sense to Cook. It was an incredible gift, and it could help him, if he knew what he was looking at, it could help him understand how the Polynesians were able to settle these areas. But he didn't pay any attention to the map at all. He barely mentions it in his journal, and it survives now. Now that we understand more how Polynesian navigation works, it survives as a document. Now, this is basically how Polynesian navigation worked. And I'm going to show you this so I can contrast it with how GPS works. This is a very, very difficult concept to master. It took me a long time to even get it straight in my head, so I'll just give you the basics. What happened over thousands of years as Polynesians settled lands is they were able to go between islands and find new islands, because they had a system here where here's the island of departure that they're leaving from, here's their destination. They would pick a reference island off to the side. They can't see the island, but they know that from here, this star is over the reference island. And then as they move, this star is over it, et cetera, et cetera. And by the time they reach the destination, they know that that star, in this case a little dipper, is going to be over the reference island. And they would break journeys up into these segments like this. Now, this system it didn't give them navigational information. They were always constantly doing very sophisticated dead reckoning based on things like swells and trying to calculate how fast they were moving. What this did, though, is it was like an operating system in the brain of the navigator. It gave him a way to understand where he was in the world. Because you can navigate all you want, but if you don't have a way of visualizing where you are, it doesn't really make any sense. So, obviously this made no sense to Cook. He couldn't make sense of this, and it took historians a long time to figure this out, because it's a very, very difficult concept. But a way to understand why it's a difficult concept is to think of it this way. There's a navigator named Walter Gatty in the 50s who was a great aviator, but he also knew a lot about the history of navigation. And he talked about how there's 3 different navigation systems, basically, that you can visualize. One is a home-based system, and that's sort of the simplest. If you imagine the earliest human societies who knew nothing about the world, if they left their village or whatever, they were thinking, okay, I'm now 10 steps back from the village, now I'm going to walk 5 steps here, and they were constantly figuring out their location in relation to the world, in relation to their home. We don't do that anymore. I don't need to know where I am in relation to my hotel room. I don't need to be like Tupai and be able to point like this right now. We have the opposite of that. We have a self-centered system. And that means that we judge our location based on objective things, on latitude and longitude. And of course, those coordinates are contingent on other coordinates. But for us, it doesn't matter. We're the blue dot on the map. And that's largely because of GPS. I think Cook couldn't understand this because he was sort of at the forefront of, oh, sorry, hold on. Well. I can just click through it, there aren't many slides. So Captain Cook, what I want to argue is that he was the beginning of this self-centered world. He at the time was testing, his 3rd voyage, he was testing something called the chronometer, which I'm sure you all know about. The chronometer was just a clock that was able to keep accurate time on the open ocean. And with that clock, sailors and navigators were able to calculate longitude. And that was a huge, huge thing. Just being able to tell time, because obviously to know longitude, you need to know the time where you're at on the ocean, which is easy enough by looking at the sun, but you also need to know the time somewhere else where you know the longitude already. And sailors just couldn't do that, and it created a lot of wrecks, and it limited how much they could explore the ocean. So the chronometer created this self-centered system. With the chronometer, we could always know where we were by latitude and longitudinal points. That's the system we have today. GPS is basically an incredibly accurate clock. And just like the chronometer was designed to withstand the open ocean, the GPS is designed with atomic clocks that can withstand the rigors of traveling through space. That's created the system that we all know, that we all just take for granted now, this self-centered system where we think we can never get lost. But there's implications of that. There's something called the cognitive map. We all have. We're all born with it. The term was invented by a psychologist in the 40s. He wanted to show how rats, when they ran mazes, actually got a clear picture of what the maze was, like a map in their head. As the more they ran it, they got a big picture. We all have that cognitive map, and there's now evidence that I think we all sort of know anecdotally that GPS use has affected our cognitive map. Now, what that means is that I think we take it for granted that GPS will just get us where we want to go, so we have no sort of situational awareness. We can never point to where we came from, or we don't have to. There's a certain amount of evidence that GPS is actually hampering our ability to do this. There's a term called death by GPS. Has anyone ever heard of this? It was invented by it's coined by park rangers at Death Valley, and it refers to people who ignore the posted sign saying go down this road and follow their GPS programs, and the map program in the phone sends them down roads where they shouldn't go, like off-road places where you need off-road vehicles, old mining roads, and they get stuck and they get lost, and they're often not discovered for days, and there's lots of heartbreaking stories. Most death by GPS incidents don't even involve death or even serious injury. There are things like, I guarantee you if you Google something, that some things will happen that have happened this week. people drive into a lake because their GPS unit said, turn right here. And they say, okay, GPS told me to. In all these incidents, you always hear people say things like, GPS told me to do this, I trusted GPS. And that's what it's come down to, that people don't know what GPS is, and I think it all behooves us to explain more, educate people more what it is, but they just assume it's something that they have that gives them their location in the world, no matter where they are, and it's impossible to get lost. But of course, the irony of GPS is that it's given people new ways to get lost. So, what I want to conclude with is, I don't want it to seem like I think GPS is a negative thing. I honestly think GPS is one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century, if not the last few hundred years. It's a gift to the world. But it's become such a big part of our world so fast that I think we haven't reflected enough on what the effect GPS has had on us, both on a sort of macro level, like the way it's part of all critical infrastructure, but also on a personal level, what it does to our sense of where we are in the world, our wayfinding capabilities. So I hope that, in my own little way, that my book did that, because I really want people to understand what a phenomenal thing GPS is. I wish more people understood the huge the infrastructure behind it that you all are a part of, because I think you seriously do some of the most important jobs in the world, largely unsung. But I wish more people knew that. But anyway, that concludes my presentation part. But I want to know if anyone has any questions about GPS, anything that I talked about, or anything related to GPS at all. And actually, let me just start with something. How many people here have had sort of death by GPS experiences? By which I mean anything where you were following your GPS directions and it took you down or wrong. Right, all of us, right? But usually you don't get it. But it just shows that even those of us, I mean, I'm a big hypocrite because I go around telling people, use paper maps. But I plug my phone in because it's a lot easier. And that just goes to show that that's something that all of us sort of kind of take for granted. But even the way I described it in a way is wrong and reflects a certain bias. Yesterday, someone pointed out in my presentation that I was saying, well, they follow their GPS. They don't follow their GPS, they follow their map program. And again, I said, you know what, that's a really good point, because GPS doesn't fail. You fail GPS sometimes. It's you, the driver or whoever. But anyway, any other questions? Anything people want to talk about with GPS? There's a lot that I didn't cover, but any general questions about GPS? Yeah.
So in your research, did you come across anything that would indicate how cities are being designed in different ways, communities are being designed in different ways in the advent of GPS? So not just kind of the unseen infrastructure, but actual man-made landscapes. Is the advent of GPS shaping the way we develop our cities, our communities in any way that you concern?
You know what, that's a really good question. And I didn't come across any of that, but actually that's given me an idea of something to learn. But what I did find is, but GPS is used in cities in ways that are pretty ingenious. In New York, a lot of the buses have a system where it's all automatic. If the bus seems to be behind schedule, it'll automatically hold a light, so it stays green so it can go through. And this is part of a whole vast thing where that signal is sent back to a computer at the Department of Transportation, which then sends it. So the bus driver isn't doing any of this, but it's part of it. So, but yeah, I wonder though. I'd have to think about that. It's a really good question. I'll come back to it if I think about it. So, anyone else?
So you alluded to this type of technological determinism that's happening right now with GPS,
Yes.
and specifically in the United States. In your research, did you identify as other nations or groups of nations are developing their own global navigation systems? Are you seeing that same type of trend, or are they still using GPS to where it maybe isn't as much of a player?
You mean, are they using their own systems more than GPS? I have to say that the fact that other nations spend these billions of dollars to build their own thing, I don't get it. It seems like it's an issue of national pride, and I think from what I can tell, people are using GPS everywhere. I don't really know how many. I'm curious, for example, how many people are using GLONASS in Russia as opposed to just using GPS. It seems to me that GPS is really at the forefront of everything now. When a Galileo satellite was launched a few months ago, there was a lot of media coverage of it, and people were reporting these things unquestioningly, saying that, oh, when Galileo is complete, it's going to be even more accurate than GPS. And I was thinking, no, I don't buy that. No, it's not. Why would it be? Like, GPS has this huge head start. It's been going for almost 50 years now. The GPS is really here to stay. Anyone else?
Well, so not really a question, but more to kind of correlate these two questions together with some of the stuff that we're aware of here in the GPS operational community. Colonel Orski talked a little bit about some other foreign systems. One of those examples is like the Japanese. They have a system called quasi-zenith. I'm not sure if it's operational yet.
I think so, but I could be wrong.
Right, but that's out in the geo belt, and the purpose of that is to provide a direct overhead persistent signal down in what we call an urban canyon, where you're in a situation where you've got skyscrapers all around you. You probably also experience this in Manhattan as well, with refraction off of buildings and windows and stuff like that. So there are system issues that some countries, especially a heavily populated country like Japan, are dealing with in their system development to help them better utilize GPS.
And Tokyo has always been a problem for a variety of reasons. Right? It's
Right.
really crowded. The address system makes no sense. People get lost all the time.
Right.
And so they're basically developing it to fill in some of the problems that GPS has. What I'm curious about is what countries are doing as to implement GPS backups. I know that some countries have re-upped their LoRaN systems. I don't think we're one of them, but in case that there's a major GPS outage because LoRaN is a strong signal. But that's something I'm really interested. I'm wondering how much of that is actually going on. Yeah.
Good morning. So you were probably surprised when you started researching GPS that it was a DoD program.
Absolutely.
Talk to other
No
people.
idea.
What do they think about the fact that the DoD runs?
It blows their minds. No, they really, I have to usually say it a few times, like, no, it's owned by the United States government and controlled by the Department of Defense. Day-to-day operations are handled by the Air Force, and then depending on how interested they seem, they'll go into, and there's a network and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, but at this point usually their eyes are glazing over because people are as interested as I am, but no, nobody knows that. And when I tell people like, when an ISIS terrorist gets a position fix on his phone, he's doing that courtesy, in some ways, of the Pentagon. What? But that's what I mean. I mean, GPS is truly a gift to the world. I don't think that's overly dramatic to say that, and that's what I wish more people understood. Because you're right. Nobody. I mean, statistically speaking, nobody I talk to realizes that it's a Department of Defense thing. Yeah.
Based on your research, you talked a lot about how history has built us to where we are today.
Yeah.
Based on what you saw and what you've learned, in your mind, what are some of the things that we might look forward to based on the direction that GPS is going?
Well, I think that as a timing system, for example, it has enormous capabilities. I mean, just take the electrical grid, for example. One of the problems, challenges of the electrical grid is that power is always moving in different directions. It's reallocating power. There's a lot of solar energy, so that's coming into the network. And a GPS system essentially what it does is it takes a snapshot of the entire grid, I think once every, or several times a second. And those snapshots have to be really, really accurate and coordinated because of and so they use GPS time. In the long run, that saves a lot of money. That saves, it saves power, it saves money. I can't overestimate how much GPS is going to be involved in food production. I really believe that, especially, as we enter a world where things like climate change are going to cause resources to be scarce, droughts. The GPS is going to, it saves billions of dollars a year at this point. And so I think that's going to be, that's a way that the GPS is really sort of helping the world. It's all based on the system of knowing where everything is. Anyone else? Yeah.
A couple of years ago, Secretary Carter famously said that he hates GPS and how dependent we become in the DoD on it. I'm wondering if you saw in your research reactions to dependence on GPS and what you see in terms of programs or people or technologies that are trying to supplement it so that we're not entirely dependent on it.
Well, there's a whole cottage industry that's sprang up to create systems that act like GPS but work in areas where GPS doesn't work. And so that, it's hard, well, the problem with those is it's hard to sometimes separate the real claims from the fact that these people, these private companies, really want you to think there's a huge problem with GPS and that cities should build a network of sort of backup GPS things. So to that extent, yeah, the people who seem to have the most backlash against GPS are the people who seem to have an economic stake in building something that is a supplement to it. So it's sometimes hard to separate. I actually forget, do you remember the context of that comment? Like, what was it regarding? I remember it happening, but I don't remember the...
They were talking about how dependent we are for a lot of the aspects of things that we do in the warfighting, in warfighting.
Yeah.
And how everything goes back to that GPS signal coming down as a single point of failure.
Yeah, and of course the irony of that is, I mean, one of the most interesting things I discovered in the history of GPS is that it took many years for many people in the military to even be convinced that it was something that they should care about. I mean, the Air Force, I think, tried to zero out its own program on several occasions. So it's just how quickly we've gone from that to this idea like, well, maybe it's too much. I mean, my understanding, tell me if I'm wrong, at this point, pretty much any weapon system has a GPS component somehow to it, right? Is that accurate to say? Yeah. I mean, but the thing is to say that we're dependent on that, but we, people in this room, also control it. So it seems like it doesn't seem that that's bad to rely on that in a military context. Yeah.
So, when you were looking at the history of how GPS became integrated into our society, was there like an event that caused that integration to accelerate rapidly, or has it been just a steady build-up?
That's a good question. I often say that Desert Storm is kind of where GPS made its public debut. I mean, obviously GPS had existed for more than a decade at that point, but it was the moment when it kind of people realized how big a deal GPS could be. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that GPS was one of the biggest reasons, maybe the biggest reason that Desert Storm was so successful and ended so quickly, because soldiers were able to just barnstorm across the desert with handheld GPS things, and the Iraqis never thought that they would be able to do that. From that moment on, that sort of put the seed along, the private industry sprang up from that, because one funny thing about Desert Storm, and I talk about in the book, is that there were only a few military-grade GPS receivers built at that point, so they had to rely on civilian receivers, especially this company called Trimble. And then once fighting started, people were actually in the field were calling home saying, "Can you get me one of these and send them to me?" So that kind of created this sort of like, I think of that as kind of the start of this viral thing where GPS, at least in the general public's mind, really, it's starting to think of this is something to exploit. Which I don't mean in a bad way, I mean exploit, like really figure out what we can do with this and see what we can build. Anyone else? Yeah.
So you mentioned in the history that there were 3 kinds of navigation. You mentioned the home-based,
Yeah.
the self-based. What was the third one?
Yeah, sorry, I should have specified that. The one that the Polynesians do is called location-based, and it involves a little bit of the home-based reference system because they're thinking where they are in relation to where they left. But it's a little bit of the objective, self-centered way that we look at, because they're looking at things like the stars, which are actually, that's an objective thing. It's not a matter of figuring out where you are in relation to other things. The thing about the Polynesians that really kind of challenges our brains is that with the way they're thinking of it, these location-based systems, they're thinking that the canoe isn't moving. What's moving are the islands. The island that they're coming from is receding. The island that they're going to is coming toward them. And the stars themselves seem to move. And if you ask them, which with researchers have done, or it did in the past, like, well, do you understand like the canoe isn't moving, right? And they say, and basically their answer is like, we're not stupid, we understand that, but that's our way of seeing the world. And how is it any different than the Cartesian method where you distort the world to like put things on a flat plane? Like this is how we see the world. So in that location-based system, it's a sort of a midway between home-centered and self-centered. And when I first moved to New York and I didn't know the lay of the land, and there was still a World Trade Center, when I would get on the subway, I would often look at the World Trade Center, and I would know, okay, that's downtown, this is uptown, and that's a little bit of an example of how we use these kind of location-based systems. Like as I was walking through the city, I would kind of always think of, without even realizing it, I would think of myself in relation to that huge landmark of that building that you can see for miles around. Anyone else?
I'm curious, since you've done this body of research, what was the single most surprising way that you found GPS in use?
Single most, I'd probably have to say the stuff with NASA and the Mars-bound spacecraft. That would never occur to me that you would need GPS. And the way, I talk to engineers, the way they put it, it's like, well, it's kind of like navigating, driving to work just by looking through your rearview mirror. I mean, we navigate by always looking back. And in a way, that shows how the home-based reference system still sticks with us. Our home is the Earth. And because there's no GPS in space, they have to think of where they are in relation to where they came from. That really made me realize that GPS is a huge, huge thing. I mean, just the ways that GPS is used to measure gravity fields, for example. All these ways that have been. GPS is such an amazing system that even the sort of noise associated with GPS can be used. I mean, there's researchers at the University of Colorado who figured out ways to measure drought based on the part of the GPS signal that bounces back, that bounces off the ground, because it's such a dependable timing signal that's a way that it's a reference point. So there's really no end. I mean, they've figured out ways to measure volcanic ash based on how much of the GPS signal gets kind of slowed down a little bit by the ash. I guess what I'm saying is I'm constantly surprised. I don't even think we've reached the limit of all the ways that GPS can be used. And it just goes to show you the power of something. I mean, I can't think of another system that's remained pretty much the same for 50 years that you can say that's a feature, not a bug. I mean, what amazes me about GPS is that you're always tweaking it and improving it and setting up new satellites, but it's still basically the same system that Brad Parkinson and his team designed in 1973. And that showed an amazing amount of foresight. Even though they couldn't foresee what was going to happen with GPS, they built a system that's basically, like I say, a blank canvas where we can paint on what we want as we learn new things about it.
So did you bring any copies of your book with you today?
I have a few. Yeah, it's actually, if you can, I'd have to go get them from. They bring them in but yeah, I do. If you're interested, let me know. always willing to. Yeah. And just a little plug. My book is also in paperback now, so it's a deal. It's not that much. So. But it's something. I mean, it's a topic that I hope to kind of always have a sort of a little bit of an interest and knowledge in, because I'm interested to hear from you what the next sort of frontier from GPS is. I mean, the new satellites, for example, what's going to be the biggest advantage? Is it the new civilian signals? Is that what the Block 3s? Is that what they're called? So yeah, what's going to be the biggest improvement to GPS when those satellites go up? Anyone?
From where I sit, I work mainly with the payload when I run through. The cool new feature that the 3s have is they process all of their navigation data on board, instead of us having to send just a line-by-line readout of where the satellite is. So the satellite's actually capable of taking a large chunk of data that we send to it and figuring out where it's by itself without us having to explain it to it.
What's the next? Is that what will come next? Do you think? How can you improve it even more?
They're being able to talk to each other.
Yeah, they can talk to each other based on that and send that data to each other.
Really be fun.
They did.
So the force.
Eventually, they'll be able to communicate with each other. We'll be able to send one transmission to one satellite. It'll tell the rest of the constellation where the rest of the constellation's at. So instead of doing 32 uploads a day, we're doing one massive upload every day.
I talked to someone at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory who will remain nameless because it's probably a pretty sort of divisive thing. He told me, I'm just curious what your reaction is. He argued that he thought that actually the control should be in the hands of more like private companies as opposed to having the Air Force do it. Is that something you ever hear? I mean, I had no comment. I didn't know what to say, but is it, and I can't remember what his argument was, but he had some argument. It was a long time ago. But do you ever hear that?
I think the control of GPS is good where it's at.
Well, that was my point. I couldn't really figure out. He had some reasoning for it. I wish I could remember what it's at. But yeah, I don't understand why you'd want to. Someone in my research who's involved in GPS, I think it was in the Department of Commerce involved in GPS, she told me that she described GPS as an ecosystem, and that really has stuck with me. It's like there's all these nodes that all work together some of them, government, some of them military, some of them private, some of them academic, all in their own way overseeing the system. And everything from what I can tell, everything works together pretty well, and it has to work together pretty well. It's truly an incredible system. And I assume like when things like Galileo come online more, GPS is always going to be the foundation. I mean, that's the way I describe people. Like GPS isn't going anywhere. It'll be like still sort of the standard for PNT. Gold standard, yes, exactly.
Another question for you. Was there anything about our operations center that sort of surprised you the first time you came in and got to see it?
Well, this is embarrassing, but I kind of thought it would be this sort of like, I don't know, in my mind, like a NORAD facility, like this room with all these like screens and everything. And I walked in, I was like, okay, so when do we get to, oh, this is like, and it was like this, it fascinated me because like that room, this little room is like one of the most important pieces of real estate in the world, and it just comes down to this room with people like looking at computers, and I remember the first thing I saw, this didn't happen today for whatever reason, but my name was on a big monitor when I walked in the room, which I think is to remind people that they had sort of, an intruder in their midst. But yeah, and also the fact, we talked a little about this when I toured the Master Control Station earlier today, that and I think it's great that there's like some enlisted people who are just out of high school who are trained to run the system. Like, that's how much trust we have in the system that that you've designed, that you can have these people who have a year of training, as I understand, and then they're put in this position where, honestly, they're some of the most powerful people in the world. I mean, from what I deliver, that's what they do has an effect on the world that people don't even realize.
In terms of ethical implications of this system, do you see that role as the gatekeeper changing as we move forward, or is it satisfactory as is current?
Like what kind of ethical considerations?
Just how this capability is used, the many different ways
you
mentioned.
Tracking is a big issue, and it's something that basically the courts have not figured out. It's an interesting thing for me. The question is, at least in this country, if you attach a GPS receiver to a suspect that you want to track, is that a search under the Fourth Amendment? Do you need a warrant? And the standard for those things has always been like, well, no, you don't, because you're just measuring them you're just following them on public roads. But what people are arguing is like, well, before GPS, they had these radio-based systems that were actually, they called them beepers, where they really had to maintain close contact with the suspect. In other words, it took work. And now they just slap a GPS tracker under their car, sit back and get reams and reams and reams of information. And it's an interesting question because you can tell a lot about a person just by looking at where they've been in a day. It's another example of how important and powerful geolocation information is. So what the courts have tried to figure out and failed so far is whether GPS is a new type of search, or a new type of tracking. There was a famous case about 5 years ago that was supposed to solve that, and it really just kind of muddied the water. U.S. versus Jones, if people are interested. It just kind of muddied the waters, and it's something we're all really going to have to think about in the coming years, because GPS I think is something new, and it's something that's when you talk about ethical implications, that's the one that comes to mind the most, and we haven't figured it out yet, and hopefully we will. What's weird to me though is like people are always telling me like, oh, well, I have GPS on my phone, so that means I can be tracked, right? And I say, well, no, because then I try to explain that it's a passive system. And what people don't realize is that they can be tracked with their cell phone because it's a cell phone, because they're pinging their location to the tower, which saves that information for reasons I still don't really understand. But that has nothing to do with GPS. So there's all kinds of kind of confusion around this issue. But I think that's going to be a big thing in coming years.
In your research, did you come across any studies or anybody's done any work on what the economic impact is, either in this country or across the world, of the GPS?
Well, that's a good question, because I've heard figures, but what sticks with me is there's a guy's kind of a historian of GPS. He was involved in the company that helped build the signal that's used for GPS back in the 60s, and the equipment around it. And he says he's tried on several occasions in a really rigorous manner to actually figure out the economic impact of GPS. And the more he does it, the more he just comes up with figures that he says are so high they're kind of worthless. Like they're in the trillions of dollars. The way he puts it, it's like they're worthless to anyone but a scholar. And I think what he means is like, it's so high that it's kind of at this point like trying to figure out the economic value of electricity or something, or the telephone. I mean, how do you even quantify it? And we're constantly coming up with new ways that, I mean, you know, last summer when Pokemon Go happened, I started playing it because my book had just come out and I was getting questions and interviews. I figured, all right, I better should know what I'm talking about. And actually, I played it for a while and I thought, this is so stupid, and so I stopped. But that opened up just there, like, another multi-million-dollar thing. But the point is, it's like, and self-driving, I didn't show the slide, you might find the dog in the car. Self-driving cars, which I'm skeptical of personally, of becoming, I think there's a lot of hype around it that's not warranted. But the fact is, it's a huge industry that's going to depend on GPS, and there's more billions of dollars right there. So it's pretty much, from what I can tell, impossible to come up with any kind of good figure. And by the way, you know, one thing you were asking about, like ways they sort of improve the world in terms of, like, this might sound silly, but I think geocaching is a really, really good thing, because I've tried it, I'm not very good at it. I have a daughter who's 5, and I think it's something I want to try to do with her. But the fact that it gets people to sort of find locations in the world and get a sense of the world and where they are in relation to things, I think that's great. I think it's fantastic that works. And it might seem like a minor thing, but I think it's a way where there actually is some good that comes out of being able to place things anywhere. I wanted to do this thing when my book came out around the Brooklyn Book Festival. I told them, well, what about if I build a sort of a system of urban geocaches based on Brooklyn literary locations that are in books that are set in Brooklyn, or maybe where famous authors lived. And they said, yeah, great. And I tried, and I realized it's really hard to set urban geocaches, so I gave up. But that's a good way. I mean, you can learn history just by walking around, and I just think you get a sense of the world. For all the things I talk about with GPS, you know, maybe affects our minds, maybe even our brains, because there is some evidence that it could have a neurological effect. I think ultimately GPS is, if we're used the right way, just gives us a whole new sort of outlook on the world and geography.
We got time for one more question. Get the room, sir.
Thanks.
All right, well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and making this event very successful. I'm very happy to see a lot of people here in the room. And Mr. Milner, on behalf of the 50th Space Wing, thank you so much for coming out and talking to us. I think a lot of us here in this room right here, we often get wrapped up in the technical details of GPS, and we think about, we don't always reflect on the social and economical impacts of what we do here. So thank you so much for bringing that to us today, and kind of opening our eyes a little bit as to what's going on.
I'm glad I could do that, and just let me just say, like, I'm really humbled to be here. I mean, from the beginning of this book, everyone in the 50th Space Wing and TUSOPS has been so generous, and I think the work you do is so important. And I'm glad I can add my little sort of not very technical perspective to what you do. So thank you again for having me.